that's our reality. And that's so ingrained in us that I always tell people, go to my website, michaelleflem.com, and one of the graphics is a map from the 60s from an Oceanographic Institute of the Atlantic Ocean drain. And this is such a viscerally important image to get in your mind, because we think of it from maps as just empty space. But if you drain the water from the Atlantic Ocean, what do you see? An enormous island landmass, exactly where Plato said that's the peak of the mid-Atlantic ridge, which itself, much of it was above water before this cataclysm. And we know this because the people that discovered it in 1877, when these professional oceanographers came back to London after the Challenger expedition, sailing ship, steamship, when they came back to London, do you know what the first thing they did was? They gave a conference. These are mainstream oceanographers. They gave a conference, then they wrote an article that was published in Scientific American. And do you know what the name of the article was? Glimpses of Atlantis. And what do they say? They say all these numerous ancient sources are now starting to coalesce with what we just discovered, which is what Plato said. Plato said that there was an island landmass off the Straits of Gibraltar that was destroyed. And lo and behold, as we are mapping the ocean floors in 1877, we discovered a landmass which lends credibility. And these were mainstream oceanographers. And so I always want to tell people that it's actually only quite a small but very loud subset of people who categorically deny this. In fact, as I show throughout my book, the enormous preponderance of serious thinkers throughout Western history have taken this subject extremely seriously. Plato, Montaigne, Bacon even talked about it. You've got mainstream oceanographers in the 19th century who discovered the mid-Atlantic ridge, who couldn't explain how Plato was aware of that. Things like this. And then really the shocking information comes much later when, we can show what certain remote viewers have discovered, which they could not have known until later geology confirmed that with satellite imagery and bathythermic scans of the ocean floor. So I think it's, as a foundational story, it is a true story. Now, how much of it is exactly as Plato described in his quite short dialogues? Well, as much as, say, the story of Alexander and his speeches is true, because we have no primary accounts of anything Alexander said, believe it or not. So I always tell people this, anytime you see a movie and it purports to show, the configuration of Darius's army at the Battle of Gaugamela, well, these are based on sources much further removed, from Alexander's time, from a different culture, from ancient Rome. We don't have anything that Alexander wrote. We don't have anything that Jesus wrote. We don't have anything that Socrates wrote. We have to take Plato's word that he was a real person, and, the handful of other playwrights that claim he was a real person. So I always tell people, be very careful when it comes to just, we teach Socrates as if he were a real person, and yet we have nothing he wrote. We speak of him with total authority, but everything we know about Socrates comes from the same person who gave us Atlantis. And I think that's extremely important to remember, is that we play hard and fast with what we like. But the second a story comes in that challenges perhaps the timeline, not dramatically, but just pushes it back, say, 6,000 years beyond the acceptable bounds of civilization, it's suddenly to be thrown out into the dustbin, which I think is terribly immature. And also, to have the intellectual curiosity to approach a subject like this actually is quite rewarding, because it unlocks so many other things that even myself, 10 years ago, before I started investigating this professionally, made no sense to me. Even as a person who grew up in the Atlantic Ocean, on Atlantic Boulevard as a young kid in Florida, this name has no etymology that we can easily trace to ancient Greece or really anything. And yet you see that tla sound in places like the Tlaxcala people in Mexico, or the myth of Aztlan that the Aztecs had, and their god, Atlanteotl, who looks just like the Greek god Atlas. And it's like, well, how are these statistically possible? Coincidences? They're not. They're an ancient legacy that we totally disregarded. And so it's great to actually go through that systematically with you and unpack piece by piece another layer of the mystery.
We'll go through all those topics that you mentioned in other episode. I think the next one will be about the historical validity of Plato's Atlantis. We'll go through the sources, we'll go through the validity of Solon's journeys, we'll analyze some ancient Egyptian sources, but you mentioned plenty of other things, so it will be a very, very long series. Therefore,
1,000
don't
episodes.
forget don't forget to subscribe to our channels, and below in the description of this video you will have the links to our books, of course, Michael's Leflam's Visions of Atlantis and mine, Déjà Vu Has Everything Already Been, which we highly recommend you to read, because in those books we go beyond the topic of Atlantis and we analyze much more of our forgotten history. So that would be all for the first episode on our new channel, and stay tuned for the other.
Thank you.